Pachypodiums. They're the spiny, heavy metal cousins of the plumeria, perfectly adapted to growing in some of the more arid regions of the earth. But they've got a delicate little secret. They have some of the most stunning flowers you can possibly imagine, and they're perfectly suited to growing in any collection. So I've got a heap of Pachypodiums in various stages of maturity of different species in need of a little bit of springtime care. So join me today as I give those plants that care, talk about the different species, what they need, what they look like, how they grow, and well, explore everything that you could possibly ever want to know about this fantastic family of plants. Pachypodiums. Let's get into it, hey? Pachypodium grow on two parts of the planet, Madagascar and South Africa. And as you can imagine, their needs therefore are quite different. Madagascar being a tropical island, those plants are going to need a lot more heat, a lot more humidity, a lot more moisture compared to the plants from South Africa that will tolerate a whole lot more sort of arid dryness. Nonetheless, they're great plants, but it's just well worth knowing because depending on your particular climate, it's going to affect how you grow these plants. This first plant I'm going to talk about is a Madagascan species. This is Pachypodium lamerei, and well, I would describe this as your gateway drug into the world of Pachypodiums. Often sold as a landscape plant, super hardy, it can indeed be grown indoors if you give it enough light. It's almost impossible to kill. This one's seed grown, a couple of years old, and having a look underneath the pot, I can see there's a root sticking out one of the drainage holes. Pretty good indicator that it's going to need a little bit more space. So, first job today, take this Pachypodium, stick it into this pot and talk about it as we go. Let's jump in. Now when we're repotting, soil mix becomes quite key, and once again I'm using an 80% mineral based soil mix, custom mix with all sorts of great stuff in it like sandstone, pumice, zeolite, bit of decomposed granite, vermiculite, whatever you like. The composition isn't that important, just keep it well draining, keep it heavily mineral, and you'll have real happy plants that won't get waterlogged. These are succulents, and so they don't want to be waterlogged. So with that in mind, let's start loading this guy up, ready to take a new plant. Now Pachypodium lamerei, like I said, bit of a gateway drug because it's so hardy and so difficult to kill that you can find it in mainstream nurseries. And indeed, that's where I found my first one. Of course, being a bit of a newbie to the whole succulent collecting thing, I did somehow manage to kill my first one many years ago, but since then I've grown heaps of them and they're pretty hard to kill off. Now, covered in spines. The thing about this plant is they can grow several meters tall. They'll get a really fattened base, and maybe the most rewarding thing about growing them is the flowers, these real beautiful delicate white flowers that'll come out. They do seed profusely. This plant I grew from seed from a seed pod that I bought from a guy growing them in Queensland. Sent me the whole pod with hundreds and hundreds of seeds, and you know, unless I wanted to become a Pachypodium farmer, I didn't sow the lot of them. Now because this has got a root coming out the bottom, I'm going to have to be a little bit forceful. There you go. You can see those thick fleshy roots, fantastic. I'm not going to disturb those roots. I don't need to do anything about the old mix. I just want to give it a bit more space. So I'm going to put it in there and I'm going to backfill now all around the plant. That's going to give those massive chunky roots space to grow into, and the plant itself will have the opportunity to grow nice and tall and fat and start turning into a bit more of a specimen plant, because like I said, this one's just a little baby. So get that all loaded up with fresh soil. I won't bore you with the potting process through this whole video, but just to show you how it works, get that all backfilled in there, straighten her up a little bit. Bob's your uncle. Beautiful Pachypodium lamerei ready to go. Find that a nice little space. This one's been growing in full sun, but like I said, they can tolerate quite a bit of shade. They don't need that full blasting sun to cope at all. which is why sometimes if you put them next to a window, you can actually grow them indoors. I've seen some incredible photos of amazing specimens that have like reached the ceiling and then started looping around. Probably won't flower indoors, probably do need to give it that variation in temperatures and a lot more light than they'll get, but nonetheless can still be quite an impressive specimen plant indoors if you don't mind the spines. So anyway, Pachypodium lamerei, sometimes called the Madagascar palm. I'll set that one aside and I'll start showing you some of the more obscure Madagascar Pachypodiums now. Here we go. So Pachypodium lamerei essentially grows as a tree, and there are a few others that are similar. Pachypodium rutenbergianum, which I think is maybe the tallest of all the Pachypodiums. You've also got plants like Pachypodium decaryi, which also quite an impressive and very tall specimen. But the other side of Madagascan Pachypodiums are the flask-shaped ones. And there's perhaps no more impressive specimen, well, probably more impressive than this little seedling, but Pachypodium rosulatum subspecies gracilius. Now this is a plant that I mentioned in my poaching video recently because the very unique, very round flask-like shape of this caudiciform plant means that so many people can see dollar signs when they spot these plants in habitat, and for whatever reason, in particular the East Asian markets, go absolutely crazy for these guys and they ship them in by the absolute truckload. Now this guy, this is a seedling, I think it's about 10 months old, hasn't really taken on that real signature shape yet, but nonetheless I'm going to get it out of its pot. It's in a very, very moisture retentive seedling mix, and I'm going to put it into my more dry, arid mineral mix today. So let's ease it out. The roots are filling up the pot a little bit. There we go. Again, want to be fairly delicate with the roots of Pachypodiums. They don't have fine roots. They're quite fleshy. I'm not going to put this in a bigger pot. I'm just going to take this old pot here, load it up, and off we go. I'll do that and I'll jump back in and I'll tell you a bit more about this particular species. So this little beauty's been potted up now. Now, you might wonder, why am I not putting it in a bigger pot? Well, for these flask-shaped Pachypodiums, the general rule of thumb is if you underpot them, you will encourage greater caudex growth. And the value in a plant like this is that flask-like shape. So we don't want to stick it into any container that's going to make it grow a little bit more lanky. Now it will take a lot of time, however, before we start seeing any real significant caudex growth on a plant like this. And I guess that's why these plants are so heavily poached, because there is such a lack of patience in this game. The most impressive specimens are those that have been around for decades. And where do you find those? In nature. Anyway, Pachypodium rosulatum subspecies gracilius, absolute beauty, and just one of many quite amazing flask-shaped plants. Anyway, let's jump into the next thing. Now, all of the Pachypodiums that come from Madagascar are winter dormant plants. What that means is that they'll grow quite happily through the spring, through the summer, even into autumn, and then when temperatures start to fall, they'll go dormant, they'll lose their leaves, and essentially they'll look like some form of stick, which that's totally okay with me. However, it is worth noting, like I said at the start of this video, that the Pachypodiums of Madagascar, coming from a tropical island, have higher demands when it comes to heat, to moisture, to humidity. And how we balance that out with, well, what can be a harsh winter can be quite a difficult thing indeed, especially for some species of this plant. There are two in particular that I've tried to grow relatively unsuccessfully in the past. I'm here in Sydney in Australia, where we have a quite temperate Mediterranean climate, I suppose you could say, and stands in stark contrast against the humid tropics of Madagascar. Now, the first of these species, Pachypodium decaryi, quite a quaint plant in that it's the only member of the Pachypodium family that doesn't have any spines, but it's beautiful nonetheless. Now, this is a plant that when I first tried to grow it in the depths of winter, as temperatures started to fall, hitting lows of about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, you could just see the decaryi were suffering fungal infections, dying plants. Turns out they're plants that really demand temperatures fall no lower than about 12 degrees Celsius over winter. So the end result here is a lot of sadness and death. When winter came to an end, those few survivors that I had, I offloaded them to people in much warmer, more humid climates here in Australia. Similar plant, and perhaps the most beautiful Pachypodium species of all, Pachypodium ambongense. It kind of grows with this fattened flask-like base up into a branched shrub. Absolutely stunning, but also very demanding in terms of its warmth and its humidity. And again, despite trying my very best here, the end result is really a lot of very disappointing plants. So it pays to know what sort of climate you're in and the demands of the plants that you're trying to grow. Now, with that in mind, I do want to share with you a success story. This is called Pachypodium enigmaticum. It's quite a new species to science, only recently discovered. The end result of that is that there's very little cultivation information available online. Despite that, I love to try new things, even if I don't know if they're going to work. So I sowed a batch of seeds of these about a year and a half ago. And the great news is they seem to love this Sydney environment, absolutely thriving. You can see these have just emerged from their winter dormancy. They've got the first leaves of spring on them. Don't need to repot this little guy. He's going to be quite happy in this pot, at least until he gets a bit bigger anyway. Just thought I'd share him with you. I don't know too much about this species of plant, but I'm sure there's going to be plenty more to come to light in the future. That's Pachypodium enigmaticum. Now, I've got one more Madagascan species that I do want to share with you. An absolute nightmare-fueled little bastard plant that dies at the blink of an eye. Let's see what it is. Now, you might look at this cute little plant and think, how can you describe that as nightmare fuel? Well, let me introduce you to Pachypodium brevicaule. And this is the plant that has the reputation by far as being the most difficult of all of these plants to grow on their own roots in cultivation. It almost feels like they just want to die. Now, in habitat, these plants are fascinating. They don't grow as trees. They don't grow with that interesting flask shape. No, they kind of grow as these amorphous, bumpy, hideous blobs that cling to the rocks upon which they grow, shooting out a few sparse leaves and a flower stalk here and there. And that weirdness is why I'm so desperate to be able to grow something like this as long as I possibly can. Now, so hard are these plants to grow on their own roots, I'm frankly quite surprised this one has made it through 2 winters, but we will see. They are plants that like to be repotted typically every single year, and where they grow in habitat, they grow in quite acidic soil. So today I'm going to try and replicate that. I'm not going to be using my standard mineral mix. I am going to be using a mineral mix, but with 2 modifications. Rather than using your pre-bagged cactus soil as the organic component, I'm using peat moss, which in itself is quite an acidic compound. And then what I've done in terms of minerals, I've upped the amount of decomposed granite in this mix, because again, that's also a more acidic element, bringing down some of the other stuff. So this should be a bit more acidic than my usual mix. Hopefully I haven't overcomplicated things and I don't kill this guy straight away. Now, don't need to change the pot size. We're just going to get it out of its soil as delicately as we can. Load it up with this exciting custom blend and we'll see how we go. Here we go. It comes out of its soil quite well. Look, there you go. You can see those beautiful big fat fleshy roots. And now all we're going to do is load up that pot. I'll be back in a sec. And there we have it, all potted up and ready for what I hope is another season of successful growth. Now, a word of warning about using peat moss. It becomes what we call hydrophobic, which means that it repels water, which isn't ideal in a soil mix, as you can imagine. Now, before I've used it today, I've thoroughly saturated it to ensure that it will retain moisture, at least for a while, but In this case, I'll be repotting this guy in a year's time anyway, assuming it's still alive then, and hopefully it won't be a big problem, but I would certainly never be incorporating it into any mix that I plan on using long term. Just asking for trouble. Anyway, that's it for the Madagascan plants. Let's jump over now to the continent of Africa itself and look at some South African beauties. The Pachypodiums of Southern Africa. Now, as I said at the start of this video, these are plants that will tolerate far drier, more arid conditions than their Madagascan cousins. And for me, here in Sydney, where our climate isn't all too dissimilar to that of South Africa anyway, they're an absolute joy and wonder to grow. Their forms also are quite different to those plants from Madagascar. While there are some tree-growing plants, they are, well, when we get to them, you'll see just how different they look. And we also have these plants that grow with these amazing fattened underground tubers, caudices, like this Pachypodium succulentum here. Now, I do have some of these plants that I need to dig up and repot, give a little bit more space to. And why don't we start with Pachypodium succulentum itself. This here is just a little seedling compared to this big old specimen right here. The wonderful thing about taking any of these plants and digging it up is just seeing how well the roots have developed. So let's get this out of its pot now and have a look. See what lurks below. All right. Tease out that soil. Okay, here we go, moment of truth. And there you can see quite nice root development there. You can see at the base, this plant here has clearly hit the bottom of the pot. You can see the roots turning in, which is why it's so imperative that we give this one a little bit more space. I'm going to plant it today in a nice deep pot to allow that depth of root development. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to keep the root underground. These are plants that once the root, the caudex, is exposed, it won't continue to grow. It will only grow with any sort of significance when it's underground. So this plant here, I've made a deliberate choice. Expose the caudex above ground here. It will continue to grow underground, like I said, but this top part, it's done. But this, of course, that's not a specimen plant by any stretch, so the root stays underground. I'll repot this into the mineral soil, and I'll be back in a sec. And there we have it, all potted up and primed for another season of growth and root development. You can actually see some new branches just starting to develop at the top of the caudex there. Now, if you're wondering about the nature of that root and why it's so fat, well, it acts as a fantastic water storage organ. Like I said, these plants grow in quite arid regions and they suffer through very long periods of drought at times. They need some way of hanging on to whatever sparse water is available to them, and that happens through this underground root system. Now, this is Pachypodium succulentum. I can also show you, very closely related, this is Pachypodium bispinosum. Now, both of them will develop that same fattened caudiciform root system. This one's only about 10 months old compared to this one, I think, coming into its second or third growing season. The only discernible difference between these two species are their quite stunning flowers, and I'll put those on the screen to compare for you now. But otherwise, two amazing caudiciform Southern African Pachypodiums for you. Outstanding. Let's see what's next. Hopefully it's become evident to you by now that I like my plants weird. And is there anything weirder than this grotesque, hideous, almost Lovecraftian monstrosity, Pachypodium saundersii? I absolutely love it. Adopted this mature specimen relatively recently. I do, however, have this smaller seedling which is in desperate need of a repot. Hopefully giving it a little bit more space will help it start to grow into this monstrosity over here. So we'll get it out of its pot, give it a bit more space, and we'll talk about it, hey? Now this plant also is well overdue a repot. I can see the roots starting to come out the bottom. Generally, it's a good rule of thumb when you're repotting succulents and cacti, Pachypodiums included, to never put them in too big a pot. Never up pot them into something that's too much bigger than the old pot. So this is what it's going into today. Here we go. You can see again those nice thick juicy roots. So here we go. Now Pachypodium saundersii is kind of the shrub-like cousin of another plant I'm going to share with you in a minute. Pachypodium lealii, both of them coming from the very arid regions of South Africa. And I talked about these plants in my poisonous plants video because, quite interestingly, they've been used for a very long time traditionally by South African tribesmen as poison. They dip arrows into the sap of these plants and use them when hunting, which I suppose adds another level of interest and curiosity. Also means we probably should be relatively careful if we're dealing with them, especially if we're pruning, but you know, I can't imagine these plants are going to kill you with any sort of speed, I hope. Famous last words. Anyway, there you go. Pachypodium saundersii, the little one next to, oh, I can't even pick that up. Oh, next to the big one. Outstanding. Couple of plants to go. Maybe some of the most interesting ones of all. Here we go. And here are some seedlings of Pachypodium lealii, that more tree-shaped, fat, bottled, trunked cousin of Pachypodium saundersii. In fact, some taxonomists would suggest that saundersii is just a subspecies of lealii. I don't know who to believe. Anyway, these are probably about 7 or 8 months from seed. You can see there's one big one and one little one there. I want to separate them, give them their own pots, just to give them a bit of a head start in life as we go into this growing season. So once again, gently going to tease them out of their pots. Oh, those roots are quite well embedded in there. Can we get you out? We can get the little one out without any troubles. There you go, you can just sit over here, but let's try and get this one out without destroying it. Aha, there we go. All right, there we go. Beautiful. 2 plants ready for their own homes. These are quite amazing plants, absolutely stunning. You should see photos of them in habitat. They are the most alien looking plants you can imagine. You know, when it comes to the South African species, lealii is king of weirdness, I would say. Truly bizarre, and hence a plant that I very much want in my collection. However, as with all things, these are going to take a very long time to grow to any sort of maturity, and so patience is going to be key here. There we go, there's one of them potted up. I'll do the other one now off camera so as not to bore you. And there we have it, looking almost like 2 miniature little palm trees at the moment, but give them enough time, a few decades at the very least, and they'll start to take on that alien bottle tree kind of form. I just hope I'm around long enough to witness it. Now, that leads us into our final species, and probably my favourite Pachypodium species of all. This is Pachypodium namaquanum, and it's quite unique amongst these plants. That's because this is the only species of all the Pachypodiums that is summer dormant. And so as all of these plants are just starting to emerge from their sleep, sending out new leaves, you can see this one has just dropped them all. Now, this plant grows in the most unimaginably arid region of South Africa and southern Namibia you can possibly bring to mind, a place called Namaquanum, and there they grow as these solitary trees up to 2 or 3 meters tall. As you can see, they're perfectly adapted to that sort of dry environment with this very thick water-bearing trunk and these absolutely insane spines to keep any sort of munching animal away. Now, The interesting thing about Pachypodium namaquanum in habitat is that they grow with a very slight lean, leaning always to the north, seeking that sunlight, that fairly bleak winter sunlight. I guess it's a little bit like why we turn our plants around indoors, because they always grow with a lean towards a window. Well, so too do these, only in habitat. Now, this being a winter growing plant, while it's got no leaves, I'm going to keep it absolutely bone dry. Curiously enough, this plant's likely to emerge from its dormancy at the very, very height of summer. Send out a spray of leaves probably mid-January, and that's when it'll start to get a little bit of love and a bit of care again. But until then, this is going to sit on a shelf, bone dry, looking good, but otherwise uncared for. Now, all of the plants that I've repotted today, they're also going to be getting a bit of a dry spell, probably a week or two. Reason being, the process of repotting can harm the roots very, very imperceptibly sometimes. But those little wounds in the roots, when wet, it's like issuing an open invitation to fungal pathogens. Come right in and start eating my plant. I know this from experience. When I just started in this plant growing hobby, I had a beautiful Pachypodium gnarly, Madagascar tree-like plant, not very big at the time. Repotted it, gave it a drink of water. Within weeks, oh, the hideous rot that had taken hold. So, let these plants rest, and in a few weeks, when they've recovered from whatever wounds they've suffered today, then off we go again. Now, I hope I've given you something to think about today. If you've got any questions about Pachypodium care, about the species that I haven't covered today, about anything in general, by all means, leave me a question in the comments or just a comment more broadly. There is that link on the screen again. If you want to buy a t-shirt, buy a plant if you're in Australia, or, find me on Instagram, well, you can find that right there. Otherwise, that's it for today. I hope you learned something interesting, and I hope maybe now, if you weren't into them before, you will be now. The world of Pachypodiums. Happy growing.